In an 1868 letter to the editor of the Clarksville Weekly Chronicle, W. E. Peffer lamented, "I am most heartily opposed to placing the black man above the white in political power, but such happens to be the case in a number of states." Before the Civil War, only white landowners could vote. But, as Peffer's comments suggested, the tide was shifting. Formerly enslaved people could now participate in the franchise. However, not everyone was pleased with the surge in black political power. While some celebrated this progress, others longed to return to a more restrictive system. For instance, an 1873 editorial published in the Montgomery Advertiser argued that the governing power should be in the hands of tax-paying whites, falsely claiming that intelligence predominates with the whites and ignorance prevails among the blacks. What was the result of their racist discontent? Beyond the violence perpetuated against black communities, Southern states passed legislation designed to diminish black political power. One of the most prominent examples of this phenomenon would be the poll tax. It may surprise some Americans to learn that states once expected their citizens to pay a fee to cast a ballot. Alabama State Senator Walker Long argued against a poll tax in 1901, saying, "The Negroes in the Black Belt pay nearly 3 times the poll tax as white people." The injustice was twofold. Not only were black citizens expected to pay more money, but their communities received fewer resources. Despite legislators using this poll tax to fund public education, black schools did not receive funding from its collection. The poll tax is a textbook case of colorblind racism. Despite the law requiring citizens of all racial groups to pay a fee, the implementation revealed its racist purpose. In 1898, Louisiana adopted a new constitution that radically restricted voting rights for black men. Lawmakers required citizens to own property, pass a literacy test, and pay a poll tax, all of which stood as barriers to the ballot box. It was no secret who these changes were designed to impact. They were a direct response to the angst of white Southerners who refused to accept black people as their equals, let alone their political leaders. The poll tax and other discriminatory measures were designed to restrict their upward mobility. To accomplish this feat, white legislators exploited racial disparities that persisted after slavery's demise. The vast majority of black Southerners did not own property, as slavery deprived them of generational wealth. This requirement alone made most black residents in Louisiana ineligible. Secondly, 80% of black citizens were illiterate in 1870 because anti-literacy laws prohibited their access to education. While literacy rates in the black community steadily rose during this period, this provision capitalized off past discrimination. The irony wasn't lost on the black community that there was an exception for poor, illiterate white men who didn't own property, the grandfather's clause, which allowed citizens to vote if their ancestors registered to vote before 1867. Given that the vast majority of black people were prohibited from voting before, these laws blocked their access to political power. The poll tax is a reminder that racism is not always bright, red, and shiny. We must consider not just the text of the law but its impact to see the harm. Consider, for instance, that charging citizens a fee to vote doesn't sound racist until you understand the motivation for implementing such a law: to deprive agency to a group impoverished as a result of their enslavement. This lesson regarding colorblind racism applies not only to this past injustice but also to those that occur in the modern era. In One Person, No Vote, author Carol Anderson described this strategy. They target the socioeconomic characteristics of a people, poverty, lack of mobility, illiteracy, etc., and then soak the new laws in racially neutral justifications, such as administrative efficiency or fiscal responsibility, to cover the discriminatory intent. Some would prefer that only white people, or in some cases, white, landowning men, wield political power. Just as Southern states crafted laws to curtail black political power throughout the Jim Crow era, many continue to share that goal of disenfranchisement. In her book, Anderson cites Paul Weyrich, a conservative activist and founder of the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, an organization that crafted voter suppression legislation that spread like cancer throughout the United States. He said the quiet part out loud, confessing, "I don't want everybody to vote." Such comments demonstrate that not everyone believes racial minorities should have unfettered access to the ballot box. Black voters were not the only group expected to pay poll taxes. Yet, this legislation discriminated against them by exploiting the racial wealth gap and other group characteristics. This strategy was so effective at depressing black political power that modern-day efforts follow the same playbook. As the Brennan Center explained, the modern approach to voter suppression can often be characterized as death by a thousand cuts. Seemingly minor rules about issues like voter ID, mail voting, resource allocation at polling places, and voter roll maintenance can add up to create significant burdens, particularly on communities of color. To mitigate this resistance, Americans must learn to recognize racism not only as cruel words or overt acts of racial violence but also as racial disparities produced by laws and policies. In the aftermath of slavery's demise, the federal government guaranteed the equality before the law of all citizens, black as well as white. Eric Foner wrote in his Directory of Black Officeholders during Reconstruction. Approximately 2,000 black men held political office after securing their freedom and voting rights during this era. To curtail black political power, white Southerners passed laws that made it much more difficult for black people to exercise their right to vote. The poll tax reveals the lengths some were willing to go to maintain a racial hierarchy and mask their intentions while doing so. A caption under a photograph of a polling station in 1946 sums it up best. If you were a Negro, you would share with other Americans the desire to vote and take part in government. But in the South you probably would never have done so, because poll taxes, white primaries and registration trickery robbed 10 million Americans of the ballot.